At the break of dawn on December 16th, 1944, a bitter cold hung over the Ardennes forest, cutting through wool coats and steel helmets alike. Frost clung to every branch, every barrel, and every breath of the men who would soon be tested beyond anything they had imagined. The German army had launched a massive counter-offensive, what would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, and a thin, beleaguered line of American forces was facing overwhelming odds. Entire divisions were under siege, villages abandoned, supply lines severed, and the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers rested on desperate, courageous stands in the shadow of chaos. Among these desperate positions was a ridge outside Bastogne, a crossroads town of strategic importance. The 101st Airborne Division, lightly armed and poorly equipped, had been rushed into position to hold the town. Many of the men had parachuted into the area only days earlier, still recovering from frostbite, exhaustion, and the disorienting jump from the sky. Supplies were minimal, ammunition was rationed, food was scarce, water was frozen or muddy in shallow streams. Yet the orders were clear: hold Bastogne at all costs. Retreat was not an option. This was not a situation where heroes were carefully groomed. These were men plucked from farms, factories, and classrooms, thrown into the cold of winter, facing a veteran enemy who had stormed across Europe for years. Some of them had never fired a weapon in anger. Others had survived the chaos of Normandy only to face an even more brutal test. The psychological weight was staggering. Fear was constant. Yet the men understood that hesitation meant death not only for themselves, but for the civilians in the towns and the comrades alongside them. The Germans advanced with the precision and ruthlessness of an army that had practiced annihilation. Armored columns cut through the snow, artillery shells tore up the frozen ground, and Luftwaffe planes strafed any target of opportunity. Each man on the ridge could hear the rumble of tanks approaching, smell the smoke of burning villages, and feel the vibration of distant explosions. The sense of isolation was complete. No reinforcements would arrive, no relief was on the horizon, and the men holding the line were acutely aware of the growing shadow of death. Yet in this despair, extraordinary acts emerged. Small groups of soldiers, often no more than a few dozen, faced battalions of German infantry and tanks. They improvised defensive positions, dug foxholes in frozen earth, and rigged machine guns and anti-tank weapons to choke advancing columns. Every decision mattered. Every misstep could trigger a cascade of casualties. The stakes forced soldiers to act with clarity born of survival instinct, and in some cases, ingenuity and audacity became as deadly as any weapon. Behavioral psychologists would later examine the mindset of these men, noting how extreme stress, isolation, and the perception of imminent death sharpened focus and decision-making. Those who survived learned to manipulate fear itself, turning terror into vigilance, fatigue into persistence, and sheer numerical inferiority into an advantage. They recognized patterns in enemy behavior, exploited terrain, and leveraged the smallest advantage to maximum effect. For many, the forest and the snow became allies. Tracks in the frost, broken branches, and the distant crackle of enemy movement informed tactical choices in a way that textbooks could never teach. One critical element of these engagements was leadership under pressure. Often, small unit leaders were young, inexperienced, and frustrated by bureaucracy or flawed orders. Yet necessity forced them to act decisively, sometimes ignoring conventional regulations to preserve life and achieve objectives. Their men followed because hesitation would have meant annihilation. Authority was respected when it served survival and scorned when it endangered life. Courage, not rank, determined obedience. In this context, even a corporal could become the linchpin holding a bridge, a crossroads, or a ridge against an overwhelming enemy. The human cost was immediate. Soldiers endured frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion, all while facing relentless fire. Nights were long and dark, punctuated by the screams of artillery and the distant groans of wounded comrades. Sleep was rare, morale fragile, and hope often a conscious decision rather than an instinctive feeling. Yet the men adapted. They became attuned to the rhythm of battle, the pause before artillery, the subtle sound of tank treads over frozen ground, the telltale whistle of a mortar shell. Every sense was heightened, every instinct sharpened. Survival required constant vigilance, courage under fire, and, above all, trust in the men beside you. By the third day of the Ardennes offensive, the significance of these small, determined groups became clear. Outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, they inflicted casualties far beyond what seemed humanly possible. Enemy patrols were ambushed, armored vehicles were destroyed or stalled, and morale among German units began to falter in the face of stubborn resistance. What seemed impossible in the planning rooms of generals became reality in frozen forests, crossroads, and ruined villages. A few dozen men could hold the line against hundreds if they used every ounce of wit, bravery, and tenacity available. This was the crucible of Bastogne, where ordinary men were forced into extraordinary circumstances. It was a battlefield where rules bent, courage mattered more than numbers, and the psychological landscape was as deadly as the physical one. The events of these days would later be studied in military academies worldwide, not just for tactics but for the insight they provided into human behavior under extreme stress. How a small group of soldiers could resist a much larger force was no longer a matter of legend. It was a documented testament to training, ingenuity, and the raw will to survive. As the morning mist lifted over the snow-covered ridges, the men braced themselves for the next German advance. They were outnumbered, underfed, and exhausted, yet every man understood a singular truth: surrender was not an option. To survive, they would have to think faster, fight smarter, and endure longer than anyone believed possible. In that cold, desolate forest, history was quietly being written by the courage of a few, standing against the might of many. The Germans advanced relentlessly. Columns of infantry streamed through the snow-laden forests, their boots crunching, weapons glinting under the dim winter sun. Tanks rumbled along frozen roads, casting long shadows over the villages they intended to seize. To the American defenders at Bastogne, it was as if the forest itself had become a trap, a frozen arena in which every sound, every movement could signal life or death. Yet the men of the 101st Airborne had adapted. They understood that conventional strength was meaningless here. Numbers alone could not dictate the outcome. Ingenuity and resolve were the weapons that mattered most. Small groups of soldiers, often no more than a platoon or two, became the backbone of the defense. They dug trenches in the frozen earth, stacked rubble for cover, and fortified buildings with every available material. They turned abandoned farmhouses and destroyed vehicles into impromptu strongpoints. Every corner became a potential killing ground, every ridge a vantage point for observation and ambush. The Germans had no idea how determined these lightly armed Americans could be. What they saw as a weak, underprepared force was actually a network of men who had learned to turn desperation into deadly precision. Corporal James Holloway, for example, was stationed on the western approach to Bastogne with a squad of barely 20 men. Their position overlooked a narrow road flanked by dense forest, the perfect choke point. Holloway and his men had rigged mines and set up machine guns to cover the approaches. The first German patrols advanced under the gray morning light, expecting an easy breakthrough. Instead, they walked into carefully calculated kill zones. The Americans struck from hidden positions, cutting down officers and radio operators, disrupting communications, and leaving the German advance in confusion. In the span of hours, a squad that should have been crushed became the spearhead of resistance, inflicting casualties disproportionate to their size. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Robert Keeley faced a similar test. His platoon had been assigned to defend a ruined farmhouse on the eastern edge of the town. The structure had been stripped bare, windows broken, roof partially collapsed. With only a few machine guns and rifles, Keeley's men held off repeated German assaults. Each attack came in waves, with infantry supported by mortars and tanks. Every time the Germans tried to flank or breach the building, the Americans adapted. They moved quietly through cellars, fired from hidden loopholes, and pulled back only to draw the enemy into ambushes. By the end of the first day, Keeley's platoon had prevented a battalion from advancing, buying critical hours for reinforcements to consolidate positions elsewhere in Bastogne. The extreme winter played a role as well. Soldiers suffered frostbite, numb fingers, and wet clothing that never dried. Yet the bitter cold was a double-edged sword. It slowed German movement, stiffened their attacks, and allowed small American units to set traps in snowdrifts and frozen streams. Men learned to read the environment like a weapon. Holloway's squad camouflaged themselves with snow, observing enemy movements for hours without detection. The Germans, expecting a straightforward advance, walked into a forest transformed into a silent gauntlet. Every snapped branch, every disturbed snowdrift became a signal, a warning, a potential advantage. Supply shortages added another layer of tension. Ammunition was rationed to near desperation. Men scavenged abandoned German vehicles for additional rounds, improvised grenades from leftover explosives, and coordinated resupply drops under enemy fire. The airborne division relied on ingenuity, improvised signals, makeshift stretchers, and even turning abandoned artillery into defensive positions. Soldiers became experts in improvisation, turning the barest resources into life-saving tools. Hunger, thirst, and fatigue became secondary to survival. Every man knew that hesitation could be fatal, yet they endured because the alternative collapse under German pressure was unthinkable. Leadership under fire defined the outcome. Young officers, often no older than 25, made split-second decisions with the lives of dozens, sometimes hundreds, in their hands. Orders were brief, direct, and sometimes unconventional. Soldiers were trusted to use their judgment. Rigid adherence to doctrine could be deadly. When a German company attempted to flank a ridge, the Americans anticipated the move, repositioned, and opened fire at precisely the right moment, turning the assault into a disastrous setback for the attackers. Coordination between squads relied on courage, intuition, and the unspoken understanding that every man's action was critical to the survival of the whole. In addition to tactical brilliance, the psychological resilience of the defenders was remarkable. Fear was ever present, but it was harnessed, not succumbed to. Soldiers developed an acute awareness of enemy behavior, learned to anticipate panic, and maintained morale through leadership, camaraderie, and sheer stubbornness. They endured artillery barrages, tank fire, and close-quarters assaults, all while knowing that the world beyond the forest was indifferent. Each small victory, repelling an assault, destroying a tank, rescuing a wounded comrade, was a reinforcement of their determination. By the end of the second day, the Germans had sustained significant losses without achieving meaningful progress. The small American units, numbering mere dozens, had held key positions, delayed enemy advances, and inflicted casualties far beyond what was expected. They had turned the Ardennes forest into a proving ground for courage, ingenuity, and the human capacity to endure. Every ridge, every ruined farmhouse, every foxhole told a story of men who faced overwhelming odds and refused to yield. This was not luck. It was preparation, training, and an unwavering commitment to survival. Each soldier understood the stakes, internalized the tactics, and executed with precision. The disparity in numbers could not overcome the advantages of terrain, careful observation, and audacious action. Small groups of men had become force multipliers, capable of delaying armored divisions and disrupting coordinated assaults. Their actions would later be cited in military studies as exemplary cases of asymmetric warfare, where the few could, under the right conditions, hold their own against the many. By nightfall on the second day, the American defenders of Bastogne had proven something extraordinary. The power of discipline under chaos, of courage in the face of fear, and of ingenuity in the harshest conditions imaginable. The men were exhausted, their clothes tattered, their bodies battered, but their resolve was unbroken. Each small unit had become a testament to the fact that war was not only about numbers, tanks, and firepower, it was about strategy, human psychology, and the relentless will to survive. And yet, the forest was silent only in moments, and the threat of German advance remained immediate. The defenders knew that the decisive confrontation was still ahead. Every soldier understood that their actions over the past 48 hours had bought time, saved lives, and shaped the course of the battle, but the ultimate test was approaching. The third day of the Ardennes offensive dawned gray and bitter. The snow crusted over frozen mud and broken trees, offering no comfort to those holding Bastogne. The German army, frustrated by delays and mounting casualties, intensified their assault. Artillery barrages shook the ground, and the whine of tanks and half-tracks echoed through the forest. Every ridge, every crossroads, every ruined building became a battlefield. Yet, the men of the 101st Airborne, numbering only a fraction of the enemy, were resolute. Exhaustion weighed on them like a physical force, but experience, training, and sheer will drove them forward. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding a key sector of the defense, moved between positions, shouting instructions, checking ammunition, and reinforcing morale. The men under his command had already endured 2 days of relentless German attacks with minimal rest, limited supplies, and freezing temperatures. Yet Harper understood a fundamental truth. Leadership in such extreme conditions was less about issuing orders and more about embodying calm decisiveness. Fear spread like wildfire in battle, but his presence reassured men that their actions mattered, that resistance was possible, and that every soldier could impact the outcome. At the western approaches, small squads continued to operate as force multipliers. Corporal Holloway's unit, now down to 15 men due to casualties and frostbite, prepared to repel yet another German advance. Using intelligence gathered over the previous days, they anticipated the enemy's route of attack. Mines, hidden machine gun positions, and improvised barricades turned a narrow road into a deadly trap. When the Germans advanced, they were met with withering fire from unexpected angles. Confusion and fear rippled through the attackers, slowing their advance and amplifying the impact of every defensive maneuver. Elsewhere, Lieutenant Keeley's platoon faced an even more direct threat. A battalion of German infantry attempted to storm the farmhouse he and his men had fortified. Using a combination of precise fire, grenades, and well-timed counterattacks, Keeley's platoon held the building despite being heavily outnumbered. The battle was grueling. The walls shook with each explosion, windows shattered, and every floor became a kill zone. Soldiers moved like shadows through the smoke and dust, anticipating the enemy's tactics, improvising defenses, and maintaining coordination under near-impossible conditions. Every movement had to be calculated. Every misstep could be fatal. The psychological dimension of this fight was as critical as the physical. The German forces, despite numerical superiority, were increasingly hesitant. The relentless, unpredictable resistance of small American units eroded morale. Soldiers who expected quick victories found themselves repeatedly ambushed, losing men in ways that seemed disproportionate to the size of the defending force. American ingenuity and determination became a weapon in itself, demonstrating that courage and strategy could multiply the effect of limited manpower. As the day progressed, supply lines remained tenuous. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were critically low, yet the men found ways to adapt. Airdrops delivered essential resources directly to forward positions despite the dangers posed by enemy fire and harsh weather. Medics moved tirelessly between foxholes and barricades, tending to frostbite, wounds, and exhaustion. Each act of resourcefulness and care preserved lives that might otherwise have been lost, highlighting the human element that underpinned every tactical success. By mid-afternoon, the German advance had been slowed, delayed, and in some cases repelled entirely. Small units, sometimes no more than a dozen men, had become decisive actors in the battle. They had exploited terrain, improvised defenses, and leveraged the enemy's mistakes. Each ridge held, each building defended, each ambush executed, contributed to a growing pattern. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, these men were shaping the battle itself. The Ardennes forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant, guiding, concealing, and amplifying their efforts. The cost, however, was tangible and sobering. Soldiers were wounded, frozen, and exhausted. The snow became red-stained with blood, abandoned equipment littered the frozen ground. The psychological toll was immense. Each man had confronted not only the enemy but his own fear, fatigue, and despair. Yet the very adversity that threatened to break them forged an unspoken bond among the defenders. Trust, shared experience, and the unrelenting drive to survive became as critical as rifles, grenades, and machine guns. By evening, the German forces had suffered heavy casualties without achieving decisive progress. The Americans held their positions, exhausted but unbroken. The defensive strategy of small, mobile, and highly disciplined units had turned the odds in a battle that had seemed hopeless. The Ardennes offensive would eventually falter, in part because of these extraordinary acts of resistance, demonstrating that small groups of determined soldiers could influence the course of an entire campaign. The aftermath left a landscape of frozen destruction. Villages reduced to rubble, forest paths churned with tank tracks, and foxholes filled with the remnants of battle. Yet amidst the devastation, stories of courage, ingenuity, and human resilience emerged. Soldiers who had endured the impossible carried forward lessons in leadership, tactics, and the human capacity to persevere under extreme conditions. They became models for future generations, both as tacticians and as examples of psychological endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. The Battle of Bastogne, and the Ardennes campaign more broadly, serves as a reminder of the complex interplay between numbers, strategy, and human resolve. History often remembers large-scale movements, divisional maneuvers, and decisive engagements. Yet, within those movements, the actions of small units, acting with clarity, courage, and adaptability, could alter outcomes in ways disproportionate to their size. These men demonstrated that bravery, intellect, and cohesion could counterbalance sheer numerical superiority, transforming individual and collective action into a force capable of defying expectation. As the snow settled and silence returned to the forest, the survivors of these engagements looked back not with triumph, but with understanding. They had witnessed fear, pain, and mortality. They had endured deprivation and danger, and yet they had held the line. The Ardennes would be remembered as a battle of extremes, where ordinary men were called upon to perform extraordinary acts, and where the courage of a few made a decisive difference. History preserves the lessons of Bastogne, not merely in numbers or maps, but in the human stories of those who endured, adapted, and overcame. Their sacrifices, ingenuity, and resilience illuminate the timeless truth of war. That in the chaos of battle, the will to survive, the capacity for innovation, and the bonds between men can shape outcomes in ways that brute force alone cannot. And in the cold, frozen forests of the Ardennes, amid the roar of artillery and the silence of snowfall, those lessons were written in blood, courage, and unyielding determination.